Hey guys, it's Jemma aka Aussie Bookworm, and today I'm doing a video on how I consume books. So in preparing for this video, what I did was I went back through the last 100 books that I've read, and then that took me back to 2017. So I keep a record of everything I read on Goodreads. When I was booktubing and book blogging regularly, I would do really detailed reviews on my website and my booktube channel and on Goodreads, whereas now I just do usually like 2 or 3 sentences on Goodreads kind of for my own benefit. And yeah, so I just went back over 100 books so that I could easily work out the percentage, and also you have to draw the line somewhere. So that ended up taking me back to 2017. I have had some years where I've read a lot and some years where I haven't read a lot. I would say like 2015 was my biggest year that I was reading. I read like 80 books. So it's interesting now that, it took me quite a few years to get to 100 as opposed to that year where I was almost at 100. So yeah, I'm just going to go straight into it and tell you the percentages of what I read and how. So the first category is audiobooks, and I read 31% of audiobooks. So I've had an Audible subscription, I think, since probably 2016, 15 maybe. I remember when I got out of high school, I just used to use like the BorrowBox app, one of the app through the libraries to listen to audiobooks, and that was really great, but they didn't have a lot to choose from. And then so when I started working, I got an Audible subscription, and this isn't sponsored by Audible or anything like that either. I just really like it. And yeah, so I really like audiobooks because whenever I'm doing anything, whether it's driving or mowing the lawn or going for a walk, cleaning my house, whatever, I like to listen to audiobooks. I have this like sensory thing where I can't listen to music for a very long time, like more than an hour. It's kind of overwhelming for me. So by listening to an audiobook, I don't get that, and I don't know, it's just really interesting. I love consuming books that way, and it's actually my top way that I've read books over the last few years. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 over the last 6 years. So I went back to 2017, but technically I could only use 3 books, so it's really only the last 4 years. And yeah, so then the next highest category was Kindle books. So I read 26% of the books I read over the last 4 years were Kindle books. I got a Kindle, I think, probably at the start of 2018. When I was living overseas, I didn't have one, and I would just like borrow books from the library or get cheap books from op shops that I could then redonate because I couldn't keep them. But it was still a bit of a pain, and you could only take 1 book. But I mean, because it wasn't too bad because I was only I lived there, and so I would usually only travel for a week or 2 at a time. But then I moved back to Australia, and I was still traveling a lot because I was living out west, which just meant that I could afford to. And yeah, so then I would go for big trips, at least 2 to 4 weeks, and I could only take 1 book because of the weight limit. So I ended up getting a Kindle. Also, the place I was living at because it was so tiny, didn't have a library or anything like that. So yeah, I ended up getting a Kindle, like an actual Kindle. Also, this is not sponsored by Kindle. And yeah, so I read a lot of Kindle books. They're mostly Stargate books that I read. I would read always Kindle if I could. It's so much easier. Once I started reading Kindle, I was hooked because it just makes taking a Kindle so much easier. And if I go anywhere, like going away to stay somewhere, I will always take my Kindle as opposed to a real book because they just get damaged. And Kindle just lasts forever. And when you're in bed reading and you're like, oh, it's the tiniest little bit of weight, and you don't have to turn pages, you can just sit there tapping, as opposed to, here's a book I prepared earlier, holding this above your head. I can't tell you the amount of times I've dropped a book on my face. I mean, I probably could, but I'm not going to. So yeah, love Kindles. The only downside is I find that, I mean, they are cheaper actually, but they're more expensive than borrowing a book from the library. And I don't have a Kindle subscription or anything. I go through bouts of having a Kindle subscription, or like Amazon, whatever their thing is called. But I find that with the Kindle subscription, like there's not a lot of really, I mean, no, that's not true. There are lots of really, really good books, but the books I always want to read aren't the ones that are on there. So I just have to buy them anyway. So now I just don't have a subscription. And yeah, so then the next highest category at 22% are my own books. Here. So this is my bookshelf, and I actually thought for my next video I might do a bookshelf tour. I had a huge cull when I moved to this house a year ago, and I ended up donating. I sold some, but I mostly donated like 6 huge boxes of books, because I used to get sent so many from publishers, and I used to go to like Rotary book fairs and just get like huge boxes for them for $10, and buy them from op shops and things like that. So the books I've got now are just the ones I absolutely love or really, really want to read. So yeah, the books I have here have come from a range of sources. They're either books I bought, books I was gifted from publishers, or books that I got secondhand. Yeah, and then the next highest category is 10%, and it's school library books. So I'm a school teacher, and if I've counted them, then they're novels that I've read to the class. So this year alone I've read 3, and then actually a half, but I didn't count a half, novels with my class. And then in previous years I've done the same. I love reading novels, and at the moment I'm teaching year 6, so by the end of the year, because we've got all these different like novels we're reading for reading groups, I'll probably like had 10 books that we've read, which is really cool. And then the next category is 4% library books. So those are actual library books. I kind of spent a few years not borrowing from the library, and I started to get back into borrowing from the library, but I don't know, I just tend to not read them in the allotted time now. If it's in the school term, I read really slowly, and I have to keep renewing, and then I ended up taking one back, and I was like, oh, I've renewed it 3 times, but I want to borrow it again, but it said I can't, so I have to bring it back in, and I did, and then they're like, yeah, you can't borrow that again. And I felt like I was 6 and got banned from borrowing The Mermaid Princess again. But anyway, so yeah, I don't borrow a ton from the library. I wish I could, I just can't seem to get them read in the allotted times. Which then leads me into the final category, which is borrowed, and I've borrowed 2% of books over the last 4 years. And one of the books I borrowed was this year, and it was from one of my students, because that said library book that I had to give back, I was like 80 pages into. One of my students had it, and she's a massive bookworm like me, so she was like, oh, here you go, lent it to me, so I borrowed that from her. And yeah, that is a list of how I've consumed books over the last 4 and a little bit years. Like I said, would love to know how you consume books. And well, that's all, folks. Bye.